Okay, so we'll get started. I'm just going to do a little sort of introduction to who Local Energy Scotland are and CARES funding. I won't take up too much of the time because I will pass over to Graham to speak about Just Transition Fund. It's not giving me the option to share the few slides that I have at the moment. Oh, here we go. Just okay, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So my name is Christina Hines. I'm shared ownership specialist at Local Energy Scotland. The purpose for this session, as I mentioned, is for Graham to give information about the Just Transition Fund. So I'll hand over to him in just a few minutes, but I'll also go over some of the CARES funding. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you can, please hold on to your question until the end, and we will get to it then. So CARES is the Community and Renewable Energy Scheme. That's the fund that's administered by Local Energy Scotland, which is a consortium of the organisations that you see here. So it's Changeworks at the Energy Agency, Energy Saving Trust, and SCARF. And you can see our priorities for funding to the right there. So since CARES has been around, we've funded over 1,300 organisations and installed over 66 megawatts in renewable energy in communities. So it's achieved a lot. So the funding in this financial year available, so the Community Energy Generation Fund has recently closed, but I would still really encourage you to get in touch if that's something that is of interest. So that's fully owned community energy projects. We expect that there will be a new fund reopened in the next financial year, so absolutely get in touch if you have ideas or a project that you're interested in pursuing, because we can help you kind of talk through what you can get in place now and the things that you can start to think about to get ready for the next round of funding. And there's the Community Buildings Fund, so that's for decarbonising community buildings. That is currently open, that closes in October or when the funds run out, whichever comes first. Again, worth getting in touch if you're not speaking to a DO already, because they can talk to you about where you are with any project idea that you have, and what you might need to get in place for the next round of funding for that. We will also soon have capacity building and development support in place in communities. That's kind of a watch this space. We'll hopefully have more information about that soon. And kind of most relevance to organizations thinking about shared ownership, and also kind of, in terms of a fit with the just transition funding that Graham will speak about. We've got the development fund, which was just announced last week, and shared ownership funding. So the development fund is funding up to 30,000 that would be used for projects by the end of March in this financial year. The fund closes in February, or again, if the funds are kind of fully allocated before then, it would close earlier. And we've got some examples there of the types of projects that might be funded in this fund. And there's guidance on this website. I can send the slides also, so you've got these links. Where this kind of overlaps or fits, I suppose, with shared ownership in particular, we've seen a real trend in the last kind of few years of community groups that are working together, development trusts, community councils, kind of other community organizations, covering a wider area, and particularly where there's a lot of wind farm developments by sort of private developers in that area. Groups are working together and looking at shared ownership offers, looking at kind of negotiating with developers and community benefit funds, but also looking kind of wider at what else could we do? You know, what other kind of community energy generation opportunities are there for us here, or what other kind of, community projects would we be able to look at? And so this funding is a really a good fit for that. So it can support things like community consultations, early stage legal advice when you're thinking about kind of, what do we need to consider if we're going to set something up here to make sure that we can do a diverse range of projects. And then there's funding available for shared ownership. So this is maybe a slightly later stage where you have an offer from a developer that's building some kind of renewable energy project. You are in discussion with them about shared ownership, and you might need some early stage legal advice on things like maybe an NDA and an MOU, through to the kind of later stages of negotiation with the developer, and thinking about things like setting up a body that might make the investment, getting financial advice, and in some cases, technical advice. And one of the things that I would say with all of these funds is not to feel that you need to have a sort of, perfectly formed idea or project before you come to speak about it. Get in touch at the early stages and have a discussion with us about anything that you're kind of interested in funding through CARES. And we can help you to, first of all, make sure that it's eligible and which fund it might be a best fit with, and also to kind of help you to shape that idea and get things in place that you need to take it forward. So that's everything from me, and I'm going to hand over to Graham now.
Thanks, Christina. So let me just share my slides. Okay, is that visible? All right, good. So I'm Graham Ayling, and I'm Programme Manager on the Energy Redress Scheme. So I'm going to talk particularly about Just Transition Fund, but also just a little bit about the fund for anybody who's not familiar with it. So the redress scheme distributes voluntary payments that happen as a result of rule breaches. So we manage the scheme on behalf of Ofgem, the UK energy regulator, and the payments come about when Ofgem investigates somebody for a rule breach, and there can be a number of different kind of things that happen as a result of the rule breach. So there can be fines that go back to Treasury, and there can be direct compensation payments that go direct to energy consumers. But there is also an option for energy companies to make voluntary payments, which come into the redress scheme, and we then redistribute those. We redistribute them to frontline charities and social enterprises, and the social enterprises are basically, it's the kind of main structures that community energy groups use, so community benefit societies, cooperatives, and community interest companies. And the funds need to be so it has to be one of those qualifying structures, and the funds are for supporting energy consumers in vulnerable situations, which is specifically just for charities, and at the minute. And then there are two other funds, Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund and the Innovation Fund, and those are the two kind of other main priorities for redress, and up to 15% of the budget can go into each of those, so 30% combined between the two of them. So it's a kind of smaller amount of the money that's available for those funds. The kind of number one priority is energy consumers in vulnerable situations. And so we have those kind of different funds, and the priority around energy consumers in vulnerable situations is split between, there's a main fund and then there's a small grants fund, which does what it says on the tin. It's kind of same priorities, but just for much smaller projects. And then we do from time to time also set up other targeted funds that sit under one of those three priorities, but It's really just a way of us kind of ring fencing some money for particular areas where we think would benefit from the funding. And Just Transition Fund was the first one of these that we put in place. And so it sits under the carbon emissions priority. So I'll talk a bit more about Just Transition Fund in a minute. Probably the other thing it's worth mentioning is we can't specifically comment on the state aid status of the funding, because we have to recommend that people always seek their own legal advice on that. However, the funds that come in, they're voluntary payments from private sector organisations, and the money goes direct from those private sector organisations into an account that we hold. So it doesn't pass through Ofgem at any point. So I guess it's probably useful. Well, I try and let people know that structure if you're thinking about trying to match fund with other kind of government funding and those kinds of things. So yeah, it is money that comes direct from the private sector and on a voluntary basis. So I guess, if you need to seek an opinion on it, let them know that stuff, and hopefully it should mean that it's simpler for you to use that funding alongside government funding anyway. So I guess a couple of other things to note. The fund is GB wide, so England, Scotland, Wales. So it's kind of, we don't have separate pots for the different devolved nations. So you kind of bid in alongside everybody. And the status at the minute is that we've just closed a funding round yesterday. In fact, the deadline was, but we run new rounds on a quarterly basis. So there should be another fund opening. We're aiming to try and open it in November, certainly sort of November, December time. So you've got a decent amount of time there. If you're brand new to redress and you haven't come across it before, the first step that you want to take is to register with Energy Redress. So we get people to register first, so that because we have a kind of responsibility to do some basic due diligence on people, make sure that they are the kind of qualifying status and all of that kind of thing. So it enables us to do that. But it also means that we can then put you on a mailing list, and we can keep you updated on when new funds open, if we've got new targeted funds coming out, or also we just sort of will try and let people know if there's stuff that's very relevant. Maybe there's a change in policy, or so from time to time we have kind of little news updates that are very closely related to redress. So next opportunity to apply is probably going to be around November time, but actually once you're registered, you then get access to the online application form, so you can see what's in there. You can start working on a project in the meantime ahead of when the new round opens, if you want to. So it is quite a large fund. We've been managing this since 2018, which is when it kind of set up as a separately managed fund. And there's been, I think a fair bit over 250 million paid in now. We've issued about 180 million in grants over the last, since 2018. But it's grown very quickly. So we had about 100 million of those payments came in just in the last year. So particularly the last couple of years, it's really grown. Our first fund was a total pot of 200,000. Our most recent pots have been 40 million. So it's a lot bigger than it used to be. And over that time, we've supported a little bit over 700 projects. And those projects have supported, I think it's actually about 850 million households. Sorry, 850 million, not quite that many, 850,000 households since 2018. So we try and log all of those things for impact and to kind of demonstrate what difference the funding has made. So it's quite a substantial fund. The minimum grant size is 20,000. Because the pot is quite significant, we wanted to we don't give really small grants. We tend to try and give grants that have got enough, where there's enough money for people to have some good impact. And the funding can be for up to 2 years as well. So the Just Transition Fund, as I said, it's kind of a sub-fund of the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. So with all of our targeted funds so far, we're not actually doing anything new under these. So this is activity that could be funded anyway, but we set up a specific fund to kind of highlight that opportunity for people. And at the minute, this fund is still running. If the fund ever closes down, it won't mean that you can't apply for this kind of activity. You just apply under the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. So, we've just, as I said, we've set up the separate fund to kind of highlight this opportunity. And the reasons that we set it up, partly because community renewables have always been in scope, but our scope is quite broad. And so we were finding that we just weren't getting very many applications related to this. And so we thought, setting up a targeted fund might make it clearer to people that it was within scope. And the timing of it, I guess, we did because of the local power plan coming from UK government. Felt like there's an opportunity there that there could be a good amount of new funding coming in alongside CARES and other things. And so what we wanted to do was try and put some money in to help the community energy sector to kind of scale up and build that pipeline of projects that can then hopefully go forward under the local power plan. And I guess the other thing that we were thinking is to try to maximize the social benefit of the local power plan and kind of bring together our different priorities. So the Just Transition Fund is to support the development of community renewables projects rather than kind of capital for installation. But those community renewables projects must be able to show benefit to energy consumers in vulnerable situations. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And so that kind of brings our different priorities together. And it's a really good opportunity to kind of show what a just transition could look like with new renewable energy systems kind of, being citizen owned and putting money back in to support people who otherwise might be at risk of being left behind by transition. And when we were developing it, we consulted the sector. We talked a lot with CARES and with the similar scheme in Wales. And so we tried to kind of make sure that it fits sensibly alongside those programs. In the applications, we encourage people to talk about, so particularly if you're applying in Scotland, definitely talk about any interaction that you've had with CARES, because I guess we just want to make sure that we're not duplicating each other, that people are accessing any help that they can get from CARES, and then that Just Transition Fund is kind of additional funds to support your development work. So the kind of things that we fund, it funds development work for community renewable energy projects that benefit vulnerable energy consumers. So it can be, I guess, how we kind of define that benefit to vulnerable energy consumers is it can be all sorts of different approaches. So it could just be as simple as you've got a community renewables project, which is then putting some of the profit from that back into a community fund, which is going to support people in fuel poverty, either with grants or maybe run a fuel poverty advice program or something like that. We know there's a lot of projects around that do that kind of thing. That's probably the most common approach, but also could be maybe a project that's very much targeted to a disadvantaged community based in their community, with people from within that community actually involved in the governance and the ownership of the scheme and deciding on what happens with the funds. Or it could be projects that directly address fuel poverty. So, maybe working with, I don't know, a social housing provider who's housing, or a sheltered housing that's supporting very vulnerable people and providing renewable energy direct to those properties. And the support that we provide, as I said, it is revenue rather than capital. We can't fund capital under this fund, but it could be, studies that you get in, feasibility studies, or technical support, structural survey, roof surveys, basically anything that is a survey that is clearly about delivering your renewables project, but also staff posts potentially as well, people to kind of project manage and bring forward the project, that we can support those sorts of things as well. We can't fund capital under this program. We can fund capital sometimes under the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund, so you can apply under that as well. Longer term, we're just thinking about how we could, if given that we have had interest in this fund, is there a way that we could, on a kind of larger scale, put more capital funding into this? And that's still kind of in discussion with Ofgem at the minute. And generally, the grant size, it can vary a bit from round to round, depending on what how much money is in the pot. But usually it's kind of up to the minimum is 20,000, and the maximum I think is 250k for this. Can be a bit higher for larger funds. And so impact so far, we've got 2 rounds that are up and running, and another round that is just going through the process of being kind of finalized, and another batch that are about to be assessed. But the rounds where we've had the results, the first one was funded 13 projects worth 2.5 million, and the second one was 6 projects. But I think the amounts, the kind of scale of renewables was really interesting on these, because we were kind of looking for projects at scale that could have real impact, but we were really pleasantly surprised by the fact that, potentially up to 90 megawatts from the first round and 20 megawatts from the second round. So I think what we tried to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but is fund projects where that we're putting a little bit of money in at the start to then deliver something that has a much broader impact. So yeah, really pleased to see those. But then I guess that last bullet point, one of the things that we were trying to do with this was to generate more interest from community energy generally, and that does seem to have happened a bit. So we funded another, I think it's more than that now, but certainly in the first couple of rounds, 4 projects under the Innovation and Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund, where they were a bit further down the line and actually needed a little bit of capital support to deliver their community renewables projects. And again, those are working on 17 megawatts of capacity. So really, again, good scale projects. So I guess just a kind of quick note on shared ownership, which obviously is kind of close to a lot of your hearts, I'm sure. So we did rule that shared ownership is in scope, so we can support shared ownership projects. Probably the key thing to be aware of is that Energy Redress does have a rule that we're not allowed to benefit energy companies, and that rule does apply to this. So the rule around energy companies is basically energy company, any organization or individual theoretically who might pay into the redress fund can't then benefit from the redress fund. So like if it's a registered with Ofgem kind of larger energy generator, then it would be out, and those kinds of things. And really the intention of that is just that organizations can't benefit from their own voluntary payments, because that kind of wouldn't be right, because it's obviously against the principle of putting these funds in place to make redress. But also, I guess, we didn't want a situation where one energy company could kind of benefit from the voluntary payment from another energy company. We want energy companies to feel happy about this. We want it to be really clearly for the public good. So I appreciate that can be a bit complicated if you're doing a shared ownership with a renewables generator. However, the way that we kind of address that is, I guess, just to try and ensure that the funding that you're asking for from Redress, from the Just Transition Fund, is very specifically supporting the community ownership and the community benefit side of the project. So, and I guess, you know, part of that is probably about just asking yourself, okay, what's the funding gap that we have? What's the extra funding that we need? And then asking that question of, okay, is there any way that somebody could argue that this is benefiting just a private sector company, and just try and, I guess, focus the ask from us on that. What's the bit that can really help us to get that shared ownership and get the community benefit out of the project? So a few tips around the application. What we do is we kind of look at what's the scale of the project compared to the scale of the ask, and the thing that we're kind of trying to avoid is a situation where, you know, you could have a hypothetical situation where somebody's actually asking for enough money in kind of preparation to actually just pay for the thing outright. And so it's just trying to make sure that that ask is proportionate compared to the scale of the project. So try and be as specific as you can about what project you're developing in terms of technology. What scale do you think it's going to be in terms of megawatts and kilowatts, if possible? But if it's not possible, try and just be as specific as possible about how, what the scale of it is. And then be specific about what activities you want to fund with the grant. We don't have a specific requirement for match funding. We will fund up to 100% of costs, as long as it's stuff that's within scope for redress. But I guess we do want to know the bit that you're wanting to fund. If you end up match funding from other places as well, we want to understand what's the bit that you're asking us to fund, because sometimes you can have a project that encompasses lots of things, some of which we couldn't fund and some of which we could. And so we just want to be clear that we're funding the right things. So that's just a kind of top tip to make sure, especially if you're doing or where you're doing match funded projects, just try and be clear about the bit that you want the redress money to support. It makes life a lot simpler for everybody with you know, just being clear about what's eligible and all of that. We also ask about what stage you're at and what stage you aim to be at by the end of the project. So again, this helps to build a picture of what the impact is. So how far is it going to get you along the development process? What stage are you at the minute? And so how likely is it that something's going to happen as a result? All of those sorts of things. And then also try and be specific about how the project will bring tangible benefits to households in vulnerable situations. So, you know, we appreciate it might be early stages in the project and it's difficult to 100% commit to exactly what impact you're going to deliver out of the other end of it once it's built. But I guess try and give us as much information as you can about what you intend to do, because, you know, we need to use that to justify the project. And so, yeah, as I said, all of that helps us to build that picture and the understanding of potential impact. And the last thing, I guess I've talked a bit about the match funding already, but I guess be clear about your experience, the kind of experience that you have as an organization and the skills, and, you know, showing that, yeah, we've got the capacity to do the bit of work that we're funding ourselves, or to, you know, commission it from someone else, all of that kind of stuff. And I only mention that just because we always ask people to assume, so the people that assess the applications, they're all people that have some knowledge of energy issues and all of that kind of thing. So you don't need to kind of explain absolute basics, but definitely give us a good view on what technology it is and what kind of application it is and all of that kind of thing. But I guess the thing that our assessors might not know is any detail about your organization. Even if you're pretty well known in your locality, we have a bunch of different people involved, and we always ask grantees, you know, no matter how well known you are, please try and be really specific about that experience, because even if we know your organization quite well, we might not know exactly the information that's most relevant to the application. So yeah, we always just kind of give that extra point, just because it's a real shame for people to kind of miss out because of information that didn't make it into the application and no other reason. That's always a bit of a shame. And so that was, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. That was a very quick kind of introduction. Probably the other thing to say is we generally take inquiries through the email inbox. That's checked by a bunch of different people in the team on a very regular basis, and that's the best way of getting through to us. We also have kind of social network presence, so you can kind of follow us on LinkedIn and those kinds of things. But the redress website is where to go for getting the link through to register, and then the registration will get you to the application form. But also on there you can download the scheme guidance, so definitely do that, because that will give you lots more detail than I've just done about what the kind of rules and requirements are, and how to do a good application. And it takes you through the different stages of the application form, so it gives you a bit more indication of what fits in what areas and that kind of thing, what information to put where. And the things to look at are there's a version of the guidance that's specific to the Innovation and Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. So look at that. And then there is also a separate supplementary guidance document for Just Transition Fund specifically. And so Just Transition Fund is under all the rules for the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. The supplementary guidance just talks a bit about the specifics of some of the stuff I've just talked through about what we want to see, that it doesn't cover capital, that it needs to benefit energy consumers in vulnerable situations, and gives some examples of that kind of stuff. So it fills out a little bit more to help you put in the best application that you can. So yeah, that was a quick intro from me, but very happy to take questions. So I can see one written one about, do retrofit projects fall in scope of Just Transition Fund? So not Just Transition Fund, but to answer the other part of your question, yes, other parts of funds, yes. So as I said before, at the minute, it's only charities that can apply to the main fund and the small grants fund, and that is something that's under discussion at the minute. So there may be a further announcement about that in the coming couple of months. But if it's not, if you're trying to do retrofit or energy advice or those kinds of things, and it's not specific to people in vulnerable situations, then it could be within scope for the Carbon Emissions Reduction Fund. Could potentially be within scope for the Innovation Fund if it's got specifically innovative aspects. And we have funded a bunch of projects there about trying to crack that very difficult thing of how do you drive up the level of retrofit, particularly amongst how do you make it as easy as possible for able to pay people to do that. So yeah, it's definitely if you go on the website as well, there's some case studies on there, and I think we've got some of the retrofit ones on there as well. So yeah, deadline for applications on the current round of Just Transition Fund. So as I said right back at the start, there's one fund that has just closed. Yesterday was the deadline, but the next fund we're expecting to launch in November. When we launch them, we generally launch it with about 3 weeks to a month's open period to apply, and at the point that we launch it, we'll announce when the deadline is, but you should have a good 3-4 weeks to apply. But as I also said at the start, if you've got a really good idea now, definitely download the guidance, register if you're not already registered, and you can start. Well, you can either copy the questions out of the application form and start working on an application offline, or you can actually start working on an application in the system. Another top tip, we generally just recommend to everybody, probably makes sense to try and work on the text of your application offline. It's an online application form, so just in case anything goes wrong, if you've got everything offline, you're okay. It's a pretty robust system, but there can be situations where people haven't hit save off quite quite as recently as they would like to have done, and it is possible to lose a bit of content, but I mean, once it's saved in there, it should be pretty safe. But yeah, just to be extra safe, we always suggest people to do offline. So yeah, you could start working on something now ahead of the deadline, and then yeah, just kind of submit within that 3 to 4 week window. I don't envisage that there will be any changes before the next round. It's theoretically possible, but we're fairly sure that there's going to be a good amount of money in the pot, and we don't have any plans to change Just Transition funds. So you can be pretty safe if you were starting to plan a project now. Can we apply with budget costs for project expenditure? Yeah, okay, good question. Or do we require quotes at the point of application? So we don't require quotes. I guess the more detail you can get us, the better. But we understand that there are some things where it could be really difficult to get quotes in place. We'll accept budget figures. We will look at whether those budget figures are kind of realistic, I guess. But you don't necessarily have to. And actually, I guess another kind of top tip is just that we do, if you're procuring things, then we do ask that people kind of just use good practice on procurement and get multiple quotes and all of that kind of thing, especially if for anything. So you can work with partners who come in with you on the bid if you want to, but we ask, so redress pays, it's a grant and it pays people's costs rather than kind of paying commercial day rates. So it will pay costs at kind of salary plus overhead level. So any partners that come in with you and are definitely part of the bid, we want them to kind of charge on the same rate as the organization that will be the grantee, so kind of cost plus overhead. So we do understand there might be some things where it's like, no, look, we've got to go through procurement yet for this, so we don't know who the organization is going to be. So yeah, so that's, I guess we just want to try and help people to drive good value. So yeah, short answer is budget figures are fine. If you can get quotes, great, but budget figures are fine. But we do want to kind of see that particularly anything that you've gone out and had to procure, that you've got a couple of quotes, that you've followed what your procurement policy is and all of that kind of stuff. So okay, so then the next one. We're looking at options for community transport. Yeah, so unfortunately, we can't generally fund transport projects just because the scope of redress has to stick to Ofgem, the energy regulator's scope of kind of static energy. So we can't generally fund things like, an electric minibus or, very transport specific projects. The only areas where we have been able to do that kind of thing is, there was an example of one project where it was supporting a development of a new model that would enable electricity from community-owned renewables on public buildings to be fed into EV chargers that people could then use from the locality with a kind of account to prove that they're local and help people to get more affordable charging. And we could fund that because it wasn't about funding the chargers or the vehicles or any of that kind of stuff. It was about funding a model that kind of got local community-owned electricity into those chargers. So yeah, that's just one of the rules that we get kind of handed down from Ofgem, that we can't do transport or biodiversity or any of that. All really good sustainability stuff to be doing, but we just have to make sure that redress stays focused on kind of static energy sector. Yeah, so if including internal costs such as staff time, can this cover existing staff or do you need to recruit new? So I guess The only thing there, I suppose, short answer is yes, it can. I guess the only thing is just that we do ask a question in there about additionality, just to be clear that the redress funding is always funding you to do something extra and new, and isn't just kind of funding something that you're doing anyway. So if you've got staff who actually you could reallocate a chunk of their time onto something that was funded by energy redress, absolutely fine. We do it all the time, no problem with that at all. But I guess within the it can be a handy thing to mention in the additionality section in the application, to just say, we'll be using our in-house staff, they're going to be reallocated onto this project, and I guess just be clear that it's something new and extra beyond things that you're doing already. The other thing that we also mention is and kind of push quite hard is just to think about what other people are doing around you or in kind of related areas and sectors. It's especially relevant for energy advice and fuel poverty advice, because there's lots and lots of people are active out there, and we don't want to be putting people into competition with each other. We want to help people to collaborate. So, but it's always good if you know there's another organization doing similar stuff near you, definitely mention it in the application and mention how you'll kind of work alongside them to be greater than the sum of your parts. We're just keen to try and promote that sort of collaborative working, because we are conscious that we're sort of putting people into competition with each other for the fund, and so we want to do everything that we can to not make that a kind of negative competition, but to actually basically make the money have as much positive impact as possible. Okay, so a specific one about would it fit GTF criteria, social care charity, house vulnerable tenants. So it could, yeah, it could be possibly. I think with a lot of these kinds of things, probably some of the key questions to try and answer or cover in your application would be around that additionality point that I mentioned. So I guess to be able to justify how the redress money is going to help something happen that wouldn't have happened anyway. We often have this kind of situation where we can fund some projects with housing associations that also have charitable status, and so in those situations we always kind of ask what gets done anyway in your normal capital program, and we would want the redress funding to be adding something to that. So if you can kind of justify, they're just doing what they have to do for building regs, which wasn't going to include solar PV, the redress funding could enable us to do the solar PV. And we have also funded projects where it's actually going to be a community-owned renewables installation on a public building. So there's one that we've funded, which has also won some awards separately, where they're setting up community-owned solar on the roof of hospitals, which is then giving the hospital discounted electricity, but also generating a community fund that then goes back into supporting people in fuel poverty. And they do some engagement with the hospital, so that if people are leaving hospital with a coal-related illness and they're at risk, that they can get referred into some fuel poverty support, and hopefully get them access to insulation grants and those kinds of things. So all of those sorts of things can kind of help the application. But I guess, with any of those sorts of projects, the key thing is just to have a look at and make sure you're as clear as possible in the application about how the redress money is going to make something happen that wasn't going to before. Any more questions? And did I catch everything that's on the list there? I think so far.
Yeah, I think that was everything. Still got a few minutes if anybody had any other questions.
Other things that's probably just worth mentioning, and you'll see all of this in the guidance, but redress pays quarterly in arrears. So we do have to do financial due diligence up front, and I know this can be difficult for some smaller organizations, but it's kind of a requirement that we have to do it for the scheme, partly because we give quite large grants. And so basically we just kind of want people to know that up front, because we know it can be challenging for some people. So yeah, it will be, there's basically the grants get paid quarterly, and it's in arrears on the basis of providing the evidence that, okay, we've incurred these costs. But yeah, I just think it's important to mention that at this point, because I know that can be challenging for some small organisations. Timescale for awards to be fully spent. So basically, you can set the duration of your grant in the application, but the maximum is 2 years. We'd love to be able to give them for longer, but at the minute that's related to the kind of contract for administering the scheme. So yeah, up to 2 years basically is the timescale for spending the award. We'd love to be able to give it for longer, especially for capital projects, because we know capital renewables projects can be time-consuming and challenging to get done, and all sorts of unusual barriers pop up. So yeah, and we'll always try and be, I think that the main thing that we want with grantees is to have really good communication. So we will try and be flexible where we can about if you get hit by something completely unexpected and it knocks you off, we'll look at being as flexible as we can. But yeah, 2 years is basically the maximum.
We'll do a sort of last call for any final questions. And if there aren't any, I'll just say thanks very much, Graham. I'll stop the recording now.